Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this week I made the tiniest, nerdiest thing that I could think of. A big old dragon and a teeny tiny temple. Of course, I need something for said temple to sit on, so I figured why not a big old rock. Now normally I'd make my rock out of a big chunk of foam, but this thing is going to be in and out of the oven roughly 10,000 times and I need to know it's not going to melt and give me lung cancer. So this time, I'm just going to use clay. Cosclay is going to be my clay of choice here for a very specific reason that you'll see shortly. You can use any clay of course, but Cosclay has a bit of a rubbery consistency when it's baked, which is going to be very useful when it comes time to texture. So once I flatten my box of clay into a sheet of clay, I can start to wrap it around my rocket ship shaped aluminium core. The shiny metal middle will help to ensure the clay cures at an even temperature, as making the entire rock out of nothing but clay would result in a half-baked center and an ugly cracking exterior. Otherwise, once my rocky rocket ship is adequately girthy, I can start the reshaping process, which essentially involves slicing random sections off haphazardly until I've got a mostly non-rounded rocky block ready to be baked. The next step in the texturing process involves taking my somewhat dull box cutter to cut my kinda boxy block into a much more rock-looking design. Since the Cosclay is kinda rubbery, the dull blade leaves an ugly texture behind, which, in this instant, is exactly the texture we're looking for. All that's left to do then is hack away. And eventually I'm left with a long, rocky, lumpy pillar that would be perfectly at home in Zhangjiajie National Park. With my rocky pillar looking pristine, I can get to work making my teeny tiny temple, which I'll start by laying down the foundation since my little monks wouldn't be particularly pleased with a wonky lopsided location of Contemplation. Then once I've cut the top sides and front flat and square, I can start to mark out the separate levels, build a tiny but also massive staircase, and then build up the walls. I also add a little but also huge pathway leading away from the temple grounds, and that's the foundation finished, so it's onto the temple itself. To make a temple that can fit on the nail of my pinky finger, I've smooched a small sheet of clay flat so I can mark out the inside walls, then cut a frame as close as I can to make the inner courtyard for the temple. Then it's just a case of adding progressively smaller levels with appropriately sized sloped roofs until I get an adorably tiny temple ready to be placed at the top of my mountain. And to fill in the rest of the courtyard, I made a couple smaller buildings in much the same fashion that I can place wherever there's room. Otherwise, that's my teeny tiny temple finished, so I'm ready to mount my mountain on this lovely little MDF disc I had lying around. Oh, and I made a couple more mini versions of the mountain to help fill in the rest of the space. Then I can mark out where they'll sit so I can drill some holes in the bottom of my pillars to fit some rods, which will then get their own little holes so I can fit everything in place on the base. Otherwise, with my rocky outcropping finished, I can finally get on to the main event, the dragon. I've made a fair few dragons on this channel because dragons are the tits, but they've all been pretty bog standard Western style with great big wings, so I thought maybe this time I'd go with something a bit different and make a semi-traditional Eastern style. In Chinese folklore, these dragons are also known as the Long or Long with two O's, presumably because they're so long that a single letter just doesn't do. To that end, I've made an extra long, extra noodly snake body that I then carved a whole bunch of belly scales into the underside of. However, for the top side, I need to make about 1 million tiny scales, which I don't want to do. So instead, I'm gonna make a roller. I'll start with a little length of dowel that I'll then wrap in a thin strip of clay. Once I've rounded the clay out, I can take the smallest of my sculpting tools, which is quite coincidentally kinda scale shaped, and start to lay out a row of indents. I'll then start the next row slightly overlapping and offset. Eventually, I've worked my way around the roller and I'm left with this. A teeny tiny scale roller that will save me an immeasurable amount of time. With my snake boy body all scaled up, I can finally start to wrap him around my rock. Now originally I had imagined the dragon would be attacking the temple, but I quickly realized that in order to make the dragon tall enough to look down on the temple, the whole thing would be too big to fit in my oven. So instead I'm pulling a page out of Thalasso Hobbier's playbook, and I'm gonna call this long dragon the Temple Guardian. At this point, I've baked the body onto the rock so I can start to figure out where his arms and legs will go. By making my noodle dragon so very noodly, it's kinda hard to figure out where his limbs would be, and I ended up changing the rear legs with some regularity as I was working. For now though, I can pop the front limbs off the body and begin to refine the shape. I'll start with a little ball that I can pinch and pull until I've got a kinda stumpy little arm into which I can cut a set of 3 front fingers. Some more pinching and pulling will get my fingers appropriately fingery, then I can add some extra detail onto the hand and arm before adding a thumb and sticking it in place on the body. After a couple minutes of finagling soft fingertips, I decided to declaw this noodle boy and replace those claws with pre-baked bionic claws, which should help make repositioning much easier. Some final texturing of the hand and arm, and I can fill in the gaps around the shoulder blades before using this dirty nylon brush to add lots of little textures to the otherwise too smooth skin. I'll then repeat this process thrice more to give me my second arm and 2 back legs. I eventually decided to put the back legs in the front so that I could really highlight the butt of the dragon and make sure it's front and center. Otherwise, some final detailing on the legs, and that's the various limbs finished, which means it's time to get started on the head. Now, as I've said before, I've made a number of dragons already, so I figured I knew what to expect, but despite my best efforts, I was ill prepared for the confusion that was trying to make an authentically Eastern-looking dragon head. For some reason, no matter how many times I poked and prodded it, it just kinda looked like a funny long lizard that was mocking me with its inexplicably happy face. Eventually I realized trying to sculpt on the rock was a recipe for disaster, so I slew this mighty dragon and mounted its head on this little block of wood, which made adding the necessary detail decidedly less frustrating. Despite that, I still hadn't quite cracked the code for making this particular dragon head, so instead I defaulted to a regular old dragon head in the hopes that it would start to come together as I added more of the detail. Normally any beast without teeth looks not quite right anyways, so I had high hopes for recognition once the teeth were in place. So I slapped a big set of gums to the underside of the upper jaw and started sticking a whole slew of pre-baked teeth into my dragon's maw. While the teeth and tongue make it look more like King K. Rool, I still wasn't entirely pleased with the result, but I figured if it's not good, at least it's good enough, so I removed the head from the block and reattached it to the body. Now, in a fine example of failing upwards, while I was joining the head to the body and rescaling the connecting clay, I accidentally bumped the nose and tilted it downwards, and this is exactly what I was looking for. And it was right under his nose the whole time. With the head mostly finished, I'll give him a couple little Chun-Li top knots which get smooshed down and blended in, then stabbed with a couple lengths of double wound armature wire wrapped in clay, which will be his horns. I'll then roll out an extra long, extra flat worm of clay that I can run the entire length of his body from his head all the way down to the tip of his tail. Once I blended this in so there's no noticeable seams, I can use a series of scoops and hooks to cut away random-ish sections of clay that can be pinched and pulled into his flowing mane. I'll repeat this the entire length of his body before coming back and using a ball stylus to cut lots of little grooves in to add some hairy texture. To make his big beard and flowing locks, I'll lay down a layer of clay wherever I want the beard and hair to sit, then I'll carve a bit of free detail into that before attaching a whole bunch of long, tapered wormy dealies to build up the Super Saiyan-esque hair. I was originally really excited to not have to sculpt wings, but the realization that I would instead be making a full head of spiky hair quickly ruined what was an otherwise good mood. Normally the hair is the last thing I make when I sculpt since it's fragile and, for the most part, it goes on top, so it's naturally my least favorite thing to make since at this point I'm usually completely over whatever it is I'm making and I just want to be done. It's kind of like the last customer of the day that seems to be the most annoying and has the most ridiculous requests since you're tired and you just want to go home. That's how I feel about making hair. Hair is the customer who walks in at closing and thinks they're hot shit since they made it through the door at 4:59 and don't seem to understand that you stopped getting paid in 1 minute and they're the reason you're going to miss your bus. Suffice to say, I'm not a fan of making hair. Eventually, though, I finished making this naked noodle boy significantly more hairy, and it's time to give this whole thing a lovely coat of white primer. However, once it had been primed, I realized my horrible mistake. I'd forgotten to give him his mustache. Fortunately, this is a pretty easy fix. I drilled a couple holes beneath his nostrils and inserted a couple lengths of fine armature wire that I aggressively sanded so a brush-on primer would adhere, then I can bend them into the right position and no one will ever know. Then a quick bit of primer on the whiskers and we're ready for paint. I'm gonna lean into the Zhangjiajie National Park style rocks and paint these bad boys with a motley assortment of browns and ochres and beiges. Basically, I want this to have all the color of fine British dining. To do the actual painting though, I want to wash my rocks with dirty browns, which means I need to convert my browns to washes, which I'll do by dribbling a little bit of paint into a saucer, adding some flow improver and a bunch of water. I'll then repeat this for the rest of my colors until I've got a lovely one-tone rainbow. And a gray one for good measure. Now, as far as painting technique, it's pretty much just poke the rocks with each color until they all kind of run together. This really is my favorite way to paint rocks, and I think it produces some pretty great results with little effort, which is really my goal in life. Great results, little effort. It works a lot better with a surface that absorbs paint like plaster or gesso, but I was hesitant to put plaster in the oven over and over, and gesso is a bit too thick and would obscure a lot of the finer detail on the rock, so I'll have to make do with spray-on primer. Once the first coat's dried, I'll go back over everything with a very thin, very runny black wash that's really just meant to run into the cracks and crevices and add some shading. Once I've covered the whole rock, I'll go back through with my brush and soak up any of the excess. Finally, for a final touch, I'll tickle the tips of the rocks with a series of beige and nearly white dry brushing to really bring the sharp edges out against the muted tones of the browns and beiges. Otherwise, that's the rocks done and onto the dragon, who I really ought to have named at this point, so from now on I'll call him Steven. Now Steven's going to be a shiny aqua-ish looking fellow, so I'll paint his belly with a light aqua, trying my damnedest not to paint my freshly painted rocks before painting his top scaly parts with an initial dark greenish, bluish, aqua-ish wash. I'll then mix that same wash into some silver metallic paint and dry brush that over the scales to give them a nice bit of shiny shine before doing a final ultralight dry brushing with pure silver. Now, I wanted Steven's hair to be a flowing golden mane, so I started with just straight up gold before realizing that was too bright, so I repainted the hairy parts with a brown base coat first before aggressively dry brushing everything with a heavy layer of gold. The brown gives the gold a warmer base to build on top of, and I think the end result is fine, I guess. I don't know, it's not blowing me away, but short of repriming the entire thing and starting again, I think it'll do. I'll paint the inside of his mouth with a series of pinks and reds, then give his horns and nails an umber wash. For the most part, that's Steven finished, so it's time to paint the temple. I'll give the courtyard a simple granite gray base coat, then paint the majority of the walls and buildings with a deep red. I'll paint the upper levels of the main building blue, and then give all the roofs a black base coat with golden trim. This isn't based on anything, I just thought it would look nice. Finally, to add some life to the surrounding grounds, I'll stipple some strategic green onto the rocks, then work my way down the sides of the mountain, adding a bit of life to the shelves and inside the nooks and crannies. Because the mountains will be embedded in a shallow resin sea, I want to make sure the base is blue since the base will be what gives the water its color. I'll start with a deep blue base coat, then wet blend a series of progressively lighter blues in until I've got the color I'm after. Normally I would have gone with a greenish blue since that's the actual color of water, but I forgot, so I didn't. Finally, to add a bit of vegetation to my island mountains, I'm gonna use some raw kimchi and Bombay Aloo. This brand of raw kimchi bears a striking similarity to fine flock, and the Bombay Aloo appears to have molded to the point of looking just like clumping foliage. I'll start with the raw kimchi and apply it onto the mountain by stippling a thin layer of PVA glue wherever I want the foliage to stick. Then I can sprinkle it over top, tap off the excess, and repeat this process wherever else I want. I really don't know what the scale I'm going for with these is, but I flocking love this stuff, so I'm gonna use it anyways, and we can say the kimchi are smaller trees and shrubbery, while the Bombay Aloo are much larger patches of dense forest. Or, if you want, we can acknowledge the big dragon crawling up the side and not overthink things. Otherwise, that's the foliage finished, which means my mountains are finished and it's time to fill the ocean. I'm only going to be pouring a small amount of resin, so there's really no point in having the sides visible, so to cover the ugly MDF and make the base feel fancy, I'm going to run the strip of spare walnut veneer around the edge. A little silicone will seal the edge to prevent the resin from pouring out, and now I've got an expensive walnut plinth with space for resin, and no one will ever know. Of course, I don't trust resin anymore, so a bit of tape for good measure, and I can attach my mountains before pouring the resin in. Roughly 24 hours later, the resin is set, so I'm ready to add some waves. However, before I do that, I decided the brown base-coated gold was still too vibrant, so I went over everything with an umber wash to tone it down a bit and give the hair some shading. Back to the water, I'll use some heavy gel medium to build up the waves breaking on the base of the mountain, then using a sponge and some tweezers, I can stipple the surface of the water to make some teeny tiny waves. The gel medium goes on white but dries clear, so to add a bit of color, I'll gently dry brush the tips of some of the waves to add some crests. Otherwise, that's us finished here and onto the Glamour Shots. As always, a massive thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon who continue to support this channel despite my predilection to taking random holidays, and a very special thank you to my newest patrons, Katie Baker, Crash of 06, Mimi Garcia, QTK, Caitlin, Haley, and Daniel, Neon Jays, Odd Seal, Here to Make Adam Say Trypophobia, Sarah, Allison Hamala, TK Dragon Gaming, Annabella, Fat Cat, Ashton Gray, Griffin Snary, Spider Eyes, Jamano 1969, Karen Esteban, Frederick Lascelle, Piet Boonman, King Haley and Alex, John Ahoy Alex, Moxie Drine, Rock Wrecker 39, Tim Van Doren, Jeremy Wendling, Graham Brocky, and A Ghost in a Soda Machine. You are the tall, rocky mountain upon which this slithering noodle of a channel resides. If you like this video, then good news, you can watch it again. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.